Hello. It's a pleasure to welcome you all. Thank you for joining this Great Unraveling panel discussion session. I'm Peter Lipman, one of the organising team. It would have been very easy to open by listing all of the predicaments we've had to try to handle so far in 2020, doing what some people call the doom dump. I don't think that I need to do that though. I'm guessing that you've all watched at least some of the framing videos, and that in any case, you'd all be able to come up with a pretty grim list on your own account. Instead, I want to focus in this short introduction on how we rely on a whole series of visible and less visible systems interacting in incredibly complex ways, physical, social, and other systems. By way of example, let's think about the devastating fires in California raging right now. What are some of the systems that are relevant? In the physical realm, we're seeing the impact of heat, of droughts, linking of course to climate breakdown. But then climate breakdown links to economics, to how societies are run, including how many of them use energy. And looking back in history, fire management by California's indigenous peoples was done very differently. Yet when we jump back to the present, one part of the current management of wildfires has been to rely on labour from prisoners in California's jails. But that usual source of firefighters isn't available this year because of the impact on COVID on those jails. And where does COVID originate? It seems very likely that it's a consequence of our impact on wild ecosystems as we leave ever less room for wild species. So the way that the wildfires in California are playing out right now shows interactions between apparently different systems having very, very real consequences. As this example shows, the unraveling is not just an abstract concept or a concern for the future. There are people who have told us that they're not sure that they can participate in this event, some from Northern California, where they're on evacuation alert, and another from Puerto Rico, where they're on hurricane watch. In fact, since weather records began in 1851, there have never been two simultaneous hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico. But we're in 2020, and that is now exactly what is forecast for Monday. And at the global scale, there are hundreds of millions of people all around the world for whom the unraveling has been taking place for generations in a very, very real way. The stresses that we will have to deal with are likely to manifest themselves in both expected and unexpected ways. For example, are there links between climate stress and resource scarcities and the rise of authoritarian regimes around the world? As well as presenting threats, what opportunities might emerge? I'm based in the UK, and one enormous opportunity that became apparent as COVID hit was the amazing and spontaneous flowering of mutual aid. Thinking about some social systems, what role would trying to maintain or increase economic growth play? How about rising inequality and the growing amounts of wealth being stored in tax havens? What is the impact emerging technologies are going to have? And what about current and new geopolitical tensions? So many questions. How do we factor them in as we strive to respond proportionately to what is unfolding before us? How might we best grapple with this complexity, with the predicaments that we recognise and the newly emerging ones? How can we best balance very real and urgent immediate needs with the requirements for planning and allocating resources for what's rushing towards us? The aim of this session is to begin to explore such questions. I hope that the presentation and the subsequent panel discussion will give you all and all of us a great foundation for doing just that. Thank you very much. And over to my colleague, Ruth.
Hi, I'm Ruth Andrade, and I'm also supporting the organizing team. And I think also when we deal with these topics, it's also good to look after our inner resilience. So I just felt like the need to take a breath. And I think this is going to happen quite a few times in the next 2 hours. It's such a complex topic, so it's actually great to have 2 hours to go a bit deeper. We're going to begin with Laurie Laybourn-Langton, one of the conveners of the event. Laurie will frame the topic of this discussion and then head over to Asher Miller, the executive director from the Post-Carbon Institute, also one of the conveners and the moderators of our panel today. We're going to start with a short presentation from each speaker on the perspectives that they're bringing to the panel, and then we're going to have hopefully a very lively panel discussion followed by a half-hour Q&A session with all of our attendees and then closing remarks. So it would be great if you can, during the whole of the presentation, just write your questions on the Q&A box that you can see as an attendee. Just write the questions anytime and we're going to select them from our panelists. So maybe that's enough housekeeping. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. I'm going to start with Sherri Mitchell, Weh'na Ha'mu Kwasset. She's a lawyer, educator, writer, speaker, and organizer who has been actively involved with Indigenous rights and environmental justice work for more than 25 years. Sherri was born and raised on the Penobscot Indian Reservation, and through her life helped to create spaces for Indigenous voices so those voices could be heard. Sherri is the founding director of the Land Peace Foundation, an organization dedicated to the global protection of Indigenous land and water rights and the preservation of the Indigenous way of life. We also have Carola Raquette here, or Hackett, should I say, trained as a nautical officer and also trained in conservation management. And she made international headlines last year when she was arrested by the Italian government for docking without permission after rescuing 42 asylum seekers in the Mediterranean. Carola was born in Germany and, in her words, felt the moral obligation to help those who did not have the same foundations as her. She's a rare nexus between an ecologist, an activist, and a ship captain. We also have, with an immense pleasure, representing South America, Pablo Solon. He's the director of Fundación Solon and former executive director of Focus on the Global South, also former Bolivian ambassador to the United Nations and the country's chief climate negotiator. He's been active against the privatization of water, a leading figure in the movement for the rights of nature, and an advocate for strengthening civil society organizations, also through art. Finally, we have Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He's a retired US Army colonel, a distinguished visiting professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary, and a former chief of staff to the US Secretary of State, Colin Powell. He has consistently voiced concerns over US foreign policy and the permanent state of conflict with the Middle East. I'm really looking forward to hearing from this diverse and impactful group of people. Remember to take a breath when you need, and without further ado, I'll hand you all over to Asher. Thank you.
Actually, I think we're going to turn it over to Laurie now. And I think Laurie can share her screen. No problem.
Oh, got it wrong. I'll turn over to Laurie. And you'll need to take breaths during his presentation. Over to you, Laurie.
Thanks so much, Ruth, and everyone else. And it's lovely to be here with you online today. I'm joining you all from a blustery London, and I hope you're all well wherever you are. I'm going to share some slides now, which is what I'll be using throughout the course of this presentation, and I hope you can all see them there. Some of you may have seen me before. I was the interviewer of a series of videos that we had mentioned there in the introduction that are companion to this panel discussion. And I am basically now going to give you a bit of a summary of some of the themes that we explored across the course of those videos as a way to give some context to the panel discussion that we're going to have in a moment. I want to start with a letter. In 1992, Henry W. Kendall, winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics, wrote this letter. In it, he warned that, quote, human activities inflict harsh and often irreversible damage on the environment and on critical resources. If left unchecked, the letter continued, many of our current practices put at serious risk the future. Now, this letter was distributed around the world to over 1,700 scientists, including the majority of living recipients of all the Nobel Prizes in the scientists. And they signed this letter, and they were compelled to do so by the overwhelming evidence that human destruction of the natural world had already reached pressingly unsustainable levels. And this is what these graphs show, an array of key Earth system metrics from 1960 to 1992, all showing serious degradation. Now, they named the letter the World Scientists' Warning to Humanity. And it said that into the future, the world would soon be trapped in spirals of environmental decline, poverty and unrest, leading to social, economic and environmental collapse. Now, 25 years passed after that letter was written, and many things happened. Two things that happened. Well, one, many words were written, warnings were made, meetings were had, all sorts of conversations were made between leaders. And the second thing that happened was this continued degradation in those environmental metrics. And you can see there the darker black line of what had happened from 1992 up until 2016, when a second letter was written, this time by 15,372 scientists from 184 countries who called the letter a second warning from the world's scientists. And as many of us, I'm sure, are in tune with, that increasing degradation in the environmental situation comes alongside us moving up the exponential curve of what has been called the Great Acceleration in human activity and therefore impact upon the environment. And the first message I want to give in this presentation today is that all of this means we are entering a new chapter in the global environmental challenge. And in broad terms, I think that that chapter has two main features. Firstly, we are in conditions of planetary emergency. This is something unprecedented in the history of humans. And essentially, we're in a state where we are critically destabilizing the global biosphere. And for me, that state of planetary emergency has two elements to it. The first is that things have been left too late. And the environmental impact is so impaired that the changes we need now are immediate, are unprecedented, are system-wide, and will require an all-society response unseen across many societies. Risk, or may have already passed points of no returns, tipping points that many Earth system scientists warn us about. And they have implications for the nearer term, for the lives of those who are alive on the planet at the moment, because they could lead to an increasing, accelerating, unmanageable increase in environmental impacts. They also have implications for the longer term, where irreversible changes could be made to natural systems that future generations, hundreds, thousands of years into the future, would suffer under. The second part of this new chapter is that destabilization of global consequence is becoming more likely. Now, the destabilizing consequences of environmental degradation have been around for generations, for hundreds of years, falling upon communities who often do not have the same voice as those who dominate at a global level. And in many cases, they've been locally catastrophic. But at the moment, a lot of Earth system science often gets attention when we think about the environmental crisis, and rightly so, and there should be more attention. We also sometimes see headlines from quantitative modelers who try to extrapolate into the future certain discrete threats, like, for example, the health impacts of heat. But we need a deeper systemic analysis to understand what this growing destabilization looks like. And this is something that is happening increasingly in security communities, as well as other communities that often don't get media attention. In simple terms, environmental impacts have direct local and indirect local impacts. Think of a large storm like the one that crashed into the port city of Beira in Mozambique last year that caused immense suffering in the moment, destruction of property, of lives and livelihoods. That's the direct effect. The indirect effect is then the one that endures for longer in that region. So, for example, the inability to provide healthcare or other key services, leading to an impairment in health and other key outcomes in those regions. They are not, of course, isolated to that area. Local impacts ripple out through our interconnected social, economic, and political systems. And often those ripples can go far further than where that initial impact occurs. And the robust evidence for the links between, for example, conflict and increased forced displacement with environmental factors are becoming more and more robust. And then finally, those systemic consequences interact with the existing social and economic context of certain countries. Countries that are already experiencing deprivation, political fragmentation, economic instability. And it is that together that we begin to get a greater understanding of what the second part of this new chapter we're entering, that this destabilization is growing and it's increasingly having global consequences. We know that development outcomes, for example, are being eroded by environmental impacts. We know that migration can increasingly be linked to, as the security community puts it, the threat multiplication from these kind of impacts. And we have central bankers warning that the risks of global financial problems are increasing as a result of environmental stresses. But it is crucial to understand that those consequences have always been, and of course are at the moment falling disproportionately on those who are least responsible and already suffer under the iniquity of global socioeconomic systems. The response to the environmental situation will always be political, up towards a certain point of environmental devastation at the global level. And as the UN has warned us, we're in a situation now where probably we already do have a world of climate apartheid, and that is something that is growing in the future as the conditions for human flourishing potentially shrink as a result of the environmental crisis. And we see many people around the world who have woken up to some of these issues. And you have to think, if you thought it was okay at 350 parts per million and at 1 degree of warming, you weren't then paying attention. And this global story, these new elements of the new chapter of the environmental situation remind us that this isn't just a problem of one technology or a story that emerged 30 years ago or a story that emerged 70 years ago or even 200. It is a far longer problem. And that is because fundamentally this is about, as the UN in its Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services said, it is a problem of how we organize our systems across technological, economic and social factors, including paradigms, goals and values. And in this dire state of affairs, we have to conclude that the political status quo at the moment is one of mass extinction and of 4 degrees centigrade. That is by definition business as usual. And in this dire moment, we see reactions from all sorts of groups who are increasingly clamoring to move us in a different situation. We have emergent movements, school strikers, Extinction Rebellion, other groups that are increasingly getting Western attention, as well as many others in the global south that have been around for a very long time, who are starting to talk more and more, at least about the first part of the predicament we find ourselves in, of this new chapter of the global emergency. A big question, though, is what begins to happen when the second part of this new chapter, the growing destabilization, really begins to increase. What happens, for example, when we reach 2024 and we may not see ourselves as being halfway towards a 45% decrease in global emissions? Or what happens if the 1.5 goal increasing, we head past 1.5, as some scientists are warning we will, towards the end of the century? The end of this decade. And I think that the increasingly dire situation has led to an emergence of many narratives that often talk more and more about doom. People are getting understandably scared, as Ruth was talking about earlier. It's something we need to be attuned to. Now, across a lot of this, the emergent movements, existing movements, and this increasing fear, we often trade in absolute narratives. People talk about there still being time, or 12 years to save the world, or that it is too late, and that collapse or other types of things are around the corner. And I can understand how that would become more and more seductive. And often, for those who are particularly concerned that that kind of outcome could happen, they use analogies like, for example, a car reaching a cliff edge. Some people say we can slow it down, others say you're naive, there's not enough time to slow it down, the stopping distance alone will take it off the edge. But often that off the edge is undefined. It is some end of the world type situation. But this is far more complex. This is not a Hollywood film where the world ends tomorrow. If you're going to use your car on your cliff analogy, we're talking about a situation where a car is leaving a flat road, a stable road, and moving off onto a topography that is far more bumpy with all sorts of surprises, that is inexorably leading down into a much worse situation. And our understanding of this is growing. This is an image taken from the UN Disaster Risk Reduction agency in the UN, and from their global assessment report, which talks about the cascading synchronous impacts that we have seen and we will increasingly see, from things like environmental degradation at the top, leading down to multiple failures, and then the social and economic repercussions of that. We are now living in a world, increasingly living in a world that is non-linear, that has the risk of these kind of cascading problems, and in which stability and predictability are beginning to come to an end. We used to be able to build cities on permafrost and run roads across ice sheets. That is now increasingly unimaginable. And in many respects, we are all new arrivals on the planet that has now been made for us. And so within that context, there is an extraordinary narrative battle. As things get worse, as destabilization grows, there will be presumably a fight between those who are seeking to make a more egalitarian world, recognizing the imperative that we do that together, that we live together or we die alone, or those who have a darker vision of the world, a zero-sum world. And in many ways, that's the situation we already find ourselves in. Those who are increasingly pointing to people who are displaced or to environmental impacts abroad and warn, actually, this is too late and we should protect ourselves. And we fear that those kind of narratives could grow into the future. But the potential is enormous to provide a new politics that does not take that route. Again, as I said, up to a certain biophysical point, our response to growing environmental destabilization is political. Migration is not a security issue necessarily as some see it. The reaction, the uncompassionate reaction to it, is where we may have the problem. And so we need to move towards a situation where, as many campaigners have said for decades and longer, we need to be focusing on sustainability. And the full picture of sustainability in this new chapter requires us to bring human impacts to within a full suite of environmental limits, as well as trying to heal the damage that has already been done to the natural world. In doing so, we need to be focused on justice, handling those injustices, not just of the present and the future, but also the past, recognizing, as I said earlier, that this is not a 30-year or 70-year or even 200-year story. This goes back far, far deeper into time. But thirdly, we need to be more robust. And I think this is, for some, at least in the communities I move in this country, an issue that is often not grasped, partly because it is concerning, and that's one of the reasons why we're organizing this conference. We need ideas and policies that are robust for a world that's increasingly destabilized, and we have to be brave in facing up to that. But we also need strategies for influence and advocacy that are robust to the consequences, the political consequences of a more destabilized and unpredictable world. And to finish off, I'm going to, if you would please forgive me, on a personal note, I'm going to talk a little bit about the intergenerational element. I'm one of these horrendous millennials. I, along with half the world, am under 35. And the majority of my life, and many of those people, will be lived in this new world. And it is an astonishing challenge. One just has to look at graphs like this, which show the amount of reduction that's needed to give us a chance at a 1.5 degree warming. And it is overwhelming to think that over the course of our generation, we have to continue and accelerate a global socioeconomic transition, fighting for every single fraction of a degree, while also trying to build a more just world in the process. That we have to heal this environmental mess, and we have to do it by contending with a cacophony of destabilization. And we're going to need all the help we can get, as I know you're acutely aware. And we need it as things get worse, and as the seductive narratives of doom grow and the fears grow, we need to make sure we keep an eye on the ball and don't let our imaginations be defined by a status quo that has failed. And we need all the help we can get from older generations as things get worse. And I will leave you all with a favorite quote of mine, and I know it is of many others, from Rachel Solnit, the author, who has written that hope is not a lottery ticket you can sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. It is an axe you break down the door with in an emergency. And as we all know, that emergency is now here, and it's only together that we can grasp that axe and take it to the door. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurie. I swim in these waters, and even for me, I feel like I would like a moment to reflect on what you laid out for us. But I would like to start our discussion. And first, I would want to invite folks to submit any questions you have or comments you'd like to share in the Q&A box at any point. Anything that strikes you at any point, we'll see we have an opportunity to respond to it. But I'd like to start with you, Pablo. And based on what Laurie shared with us, and your work as a former Bolivian ambassador to the United Nations, the work that you've done on climate negotiation and the rights of nature, can you talk about how you see these key drivers of destabilization and how they may be interacting with one another?
Well, thank you very much, and I like very much the presentation of Laurie. Yes, I think that we are living a systemic crisis. It is the combination of an environmental climate crisis, a deep economic crisis, a social crisis, a political crisis, a health crisis, an institutional crisis, and they are all coming together and acting one against the other. And if we see it as a systemic crisis, of course, when we discuss about alternatives, we have to think on systemic alternatives. We cannot only deal with an economic alternative and think that this will fix the issue, or an environmental alternative and this will fix the systemic crisis. No, we have to think on alternatives that deal with this different crises that are coming together. The second thing that I want to highlight is that, in my opinion, we have entered a new phase in capitalism. We come from the neoliberal capitalism, neoliberal globalization, but now we have entered a phase of capitalism of chaos. It's different. It's a capitalism where we are going to see neoliberal measures, but we are also, for example, going to see that the state begins to intervene because the chaos and the problems are so huge that there has to be some kind of intervention of the state when it comes to health, or when it comes to solve some critical problems, because otherwise this is going to explode in social violence. We are heading to more social violence and more confrontation. Now, are we going to go back to some kind of normality? I think the answer is no. Normality is something that you can predict in some way. It can change, but at least you know, okay, this will happen now. And the characteristic of this capitalism of chaos is that unpredictability is in the center. And you cannot expect, but suddenly you will have not only a health crisis, but a deep economic crisis, a food crisis. And this brings us to a phase where normality, where predictability is not possible as it was before. And this makes even more complicated the situation, because we have to think on systemic alternatives in a situation where you cannot predict exactly how things are going to unravel. And there are those, I mean, there is a discussion going on, hey, we should go and have a new Green Deal, let's have it, no? And think that it's possible, a deal. I would love to think that it's possible, but because of my analysis, I say, no, we're not heading to a new deal. We're heading to a huge confrontation, a new stage in class struggle, social struggle, racial struggle. And it will depend who wins in this struggle in order to establish if we are going to have a deal and what kind of new deal will it be. So now the key moment, as I see in the current situation, is who's going to win in this huge struggle that we are having. Going very quickly to South America, for example, when it comes to the environment, there has been no peace for the forest. Deforestation in the Amazon has increased even during the quarantine and the pandemic. And the indigenous people have been more attacked, have suffered more. We're in a situation where hundreds of thousands are being thrown out to the street without jobs. So we need to build a new kind of alliance among all these different actors in order to be able to confront this situation. In our case, we have said clearly one point that we have in common among different countries, among different movements, is we have to preserve the Amazon. Our contribution to climate change is let's stop the ecocide that is coming on. And let's build an alliance between indigenous people in the 9 countries. Let's bring together different social movements that are there. Let's bring REPAM, and let's begin to act together with the goal to see all the different alternatives that we have. Yesterday we had, for example, in Bolivia, the tribunal on the International Tribunal on the Rights of Nature. And it was for the first time that they had 4 days of hearings to come to a conclusion. What happened really in the Amazon last year? It was an ecocide. Who were the responsibles of that ecocide? How should we act? And how should we organize? And here we have a problem in South America, because responsibles of that ecocide are, of course, the big agribusiness, right-wing forces, but also left-wing forces. So the left, because of its vision of productivism, of growth and development, allowed that ecocide from happening. So in order to build an alternative, we have to be very self-critical from what we have done, because we are also part of the responsibles of what has happened. And I think this is the key challenge that we have, because if there is not a reinvention too of the process of articulation of social movements, it's going to be difficult to advance in concrete terms in victories in this deep struggle that we are seeing at different levels.
Thank you so much, Paulo. There's a lot there, I think, to unpack, and hopefully we can get back to some of the themes you talked about. I want to turn now to you, Carola, and you're well known for your actions as a sea captain when you rescued migrants in the Mediterranean. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what motivated you to act when you did, and what you think is going to happen to the people that are going to be forcefully displaced from their homes as environmental and economic and political systems further destabilize.
When I first started volunteering in the Mediterranean Sea in 2016, I perceived this as a pure human rights crisis. I became witness to several shipwrecks as well. That made me quickly understand that the crisis is political and rooted in the global inequality, which we can see everywhere. However, the reaction of most of the global North countries, instead of working to resolve problems at the roots where they're really caused, is just to shut down the borders and basically remove any possibility for people to even access asylum in the first place. And when we now have people during the corona crisis speaking about this extension of mutual aid, I would like to point out that very often just really is given to people who are being perceived as part of a certain in-group. But for example, refugees who are at this moment in this completely overcrowded camps in Greece on the offshore islands, it doesn't extend to them at all. They have absolutely no access to health care, and they are not being transferred from these places, even though they are completely overcrowded. When we look at what the UN is saying, that we're looking forward to getting into a situation of climate apartheid, where the poor who are most affected from the environmental breakdown are going to become even more poor, that doesn't, of course, make anyone very hopeful. Especially when we see that already now, for example, the budget of the European Border Police Frontex has doubled within the last 5 years and is set to increase even further. At the same time, there are cooperation treaties with authoritarian countries which are known for human rights abuses, be it Turkey, Libya, or also Niger and Mali, where people are systemically prevented from reaching any safe place. And that is already now, before we actually have that huge environmental breakdown coming. And then speaking about migration generally, we often have people displaced in fast events such as hurricanes or so on. But when we speak about the degradation, for example, changes in precipitation patterns leading to people losing their livelihoods, then, for example, migrating to cities, and then at some point possibly crossing another border, that's where typically things start to get quite contentious. Then it becomes really difficult to distinguish between who is a so-called economic migrant and who is an environmental refugee, because such a term or a climate refugee does not exist at all in this present moment. Let's just remember that Geneva Convention on Refugee Rights was written after the Second World War, and there was no idea of an environmental refugee. So that is, of course, something which would need really, really quickly to change. At the moment, the narratives are really much driven by the far right. There's this narrative of purity, of nations living in their home countries. There's this proposal of lifeboat ethics, of overpopulation. And what I see us heading into, in Europe at least, is the creation of a green fortress, where some countries which are within the walls of the fortress will be trying to protect themselves as best as they can of any people who are trying to seek shelter. And that is based on the situation which we have already now. For example, where in March, asylum seekers have been shot by the Greek border police, and it hasn't caused any interest or outrage in the European Union at all. It just happened, the same as we have a very strong cooperation from the European Union with the Libyan regime and the human rights abuses which are being carried out there. So what we need, I think, is really working on resolving the roots of the problems which are causing this inequality and the environmental breakdown, while at the same time finding a legal basis and protection mechanisms for people who are being displaced and who are losing their livelihoods. These are the two things we really urgently would need to do as a global community.
Thank you, Carola. I'd like to turn now to Larry. Let's see if we can get Larry's video and audio to work. There you are, Larry. Okay. So Larry, I mean, you've been at the highest levels in the US government and the US military. I know that you're a member of the Climate and Security Working Group. Can you summarize how the US military, from your view, is preparing and responding to growing environmental and societal destabilization?
Well, thank you, Asher, and thank you for putting this on. I listened to Carola with some real angst because we had just finished a series of simulations that told me what she was describing as already happening wouldn't happen probably until just before mid-century. And it's quite clear that the 170 million refugees in the world that we have now, many of them from places like Syria and Yemen and so forth, are going to make the total we dealt with in our simulations, 500 billion by 2050. And I'll get back to that in just a moment. But let me start from let me say that I have a lot of views on the climate crisis that aren't national security views. Every other aspect I suspect that we're going to discuss during this conference. But I want to come at it from that point of view: military, national security, and global security. Not only because you asked me to do that, but because I'm immersed in that right now, as you indicated with the Climate and Security Working Group, which is essentially military or military retirees or Homeland Security retirees before we even had a Homeland Security Department. People like those from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and so forth. Our Government Accountability Office, the GAO, estimates in a report recently released that from roughly 2005 to 2016, the United States spent almost $500 billion, $450+ billion on domestic crises, many of which could be associated readily with the climate crisis. That's a big concern to the United States military. What really got the military interested, though, in a serious way, and as far back as almost 2.5 decades, was sea rise. Sea rise threatens billions of dollars of military facilities, particularly, as you might suspect, on coast, but also inland. We've seen some of the flooding in Houston. We've seen some of the flooding in Iowa and elsewhere where there are military facilities. Not only that, we've had a real shock with the Central Pacific. $300 million facility built only a few years ago on Kwajalein Atoll is now unusable. Is gone in terms of utility, and all that money wasted essentially because of sea rise. In Alaska, we had a $100 million facility built on permafrost that now is unusable because the permafrost is melting much faster than anybody thought it would. These are the kinds of things that really energize the practical people in the military. Not only do we have a problem on the East Coast, where Virginia has in its Tidewater region, Norfolk naval facilities, the largest ship repair and ship facility in the United States. We also have a coastline that's subsiding, and we have sea rise. So we are already looking at hundreds of billions of dollars needed to be spent on Norfolk just to do adaptation, let alone any kind of amelioration. And there's an argument that we had in the CSWG, a discussion, I should say, for so long that it was so irritating you want to jump out of your chair lots of times. We could not talk about amelioration. We could talk about adaptation because we had the science and we could show people that it was actually happening, but not amelioration because it was politically sensitive. We couldn't talk about something that a lot of the Congress might disagree with, might call a hoax or whatever. Fortunately, a few years ago, that dissipated. It dissipated so strongly that the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, was able to essentially defy his own president and leave in the national military strategy and in his message and guidance to the United States military, the climate crisis as an existential threat coming at us like a freight train. One of the things that cemented that view was a series of exercises done by the Center for Naval Analyses, and this brings me back to Carola's comments. These exercises were done over a course of 2 years. They involved alternative scenario building between each iteration of the exercise. And what we saw about mid-century or so, 2045, 2050, which is not very far away, was, as I said, 500 billion plus refugees. And what we saw was the global north initially trying, as Carola has indicated, sadly enough, is probably already starting today, trying to deal with this flow by building refugee camps and doing the kinds of things that humanitarian instincts would suggest the global north would do. We call them the peer powers. It ran from, of course, Tokyo through Washington over to Moscow and Beijing. But it didn't take very long. Within 10 years, all of those powers were putting their militaries on their southern borders, manning those borders with machine guns, and shooting people. That's what turned out in the simulation. Admittedly, a worst case scenario, but we looked at all the scenarios that developed, and that was one of them. We had international players. We had Germans, Japanese, Chinese, and so forth making these decisions. They were former military people, they were former government officials, they were scholars, functional experts, and so forth. This is what we learned from CNA's analyses and these simulations. It is a real challenge for the United States military because they see what's happening domestically. Take the two hurricanes that almost were near simultaneous in Florida and Texas, where Governor Abbott in Texas dispatched National Guard to help the governor in Florida meet the crisis there, only to have to call his guardsmen back in order to handle the crisis in Texas. Well, the military watched that very closely because a lot of military facilities are in those two states. We know in the military that the domestic crisis is going to be such that it will inhibit our ability to perform our mission significantly as time goes by. Well, what is that mission? That mission is increasingly delivering disaster assistance and humanitarian relief to people impacted by the climate crisis. We go back to 2005 in Aceh province in Indonesia when over 230,000 people were killed by the tsunami. Colin Powell came back from visiting Indonesia and said it looked like a nuclear landscape. It looked like a nuclear weapon or two or three had gone off in Indonesia. Or 2014, the typhoon in the Philippines. These all cost lots of money for the United States to react to, and they cost lots of military forces in order to react, including in 2014, an aircraft carrier battle group. So we're talking about some real serious considerations for the United States military and for national security and ultimately global security. The increasing instability caused by climate change is the biggest concern. That means state failure, it means state collapse, it means more war, it means more conflict. And I take what Carola and others have said, and I know others are going to talk about too, to heart, what I call predatory capitalism. The system we have in the world today, largely sponsored, executed, and forced on the world by the United States, has got to change. It simply has to change. No one realizes that more intrinsically than the military, because the military knows it's going to have to deal with everything that flows out of this that looks even minimally like a serious security crisis. So that's where I'm coming from in terms of the climate crisis. But as I said, there are lots of other aspects to this that trouble me just as much as the military aspects and the national security aspects.
Thanks, Larry. That's your last statement really kind of floors me. I'd like to come back to that at some point. Just the idea of that recognition within the military. But I'd like to now turn to Sherri, and hopefully Sherri is able to get her video and microphone working. Sherri, not to make you a spokesperson for Indigenous peoples around the world, but from your perspective and in your work working with Indigenous communities around the world, Indigenous communities have been disproportionately affected and have suffered under environmental and societal crises for centuries and centuries. What can these experiences teach us about where we are currently and what we might expect?
Well, first of all, I just want to just say, Andali Wisi Weh'na Ha'mu Kwasset Najio Ben Wapskewi, Silda and Donabama Kawasus Noban Wapskewi, Nagakakus Notabayek, to acknowledge my family. My family is Bear Clan from the Penobscot Nation and Crow Clan from the Passamaquoddy tribe in Tabayek. And I'll try to answer your question in the 5 minutes allotted. So there is this quote by Felix Cohen, and Felix Cohen was the architect of the Cohen Handbook on Federal Indian Law, which was a real concise compilation of all of the laws and treaties that had been enacted during his lifetime relating to American Indian people. And the most famous quote by Felix Cohen, based on his lifetime of doing that work for the federal government, was that the American Indian was the miner's canary who signaled the shift from fresh air to poisonous gas within our systems. And I think that if you look at the fact that Indigenous peoples, not just in the United States, but around the world, have been sounding the alarm on the catastrophic outcomes of the current pathway, that quote becomes somewhat prophetic, that we have been dealing with systems of colonialism and capitalism and taking the brunt of impacts for those things for centuries. And one of the things that we've learned about colonialism and capitalism is that there's no endpoint. And so now what we are seeing is this capitalistic beast has turned around and it's now cannibalizing itself. And so all those who thought that they were safe from the impacts of unchecked capitalism, ongoing colonialism, and colonization. If you think colonization's dead, just look at what's going on with our water. We're all being colonized based on the control of our water on a global scale. That those things are now turning around and they're impacting those who were part of the original colonial set, who thought that they were in the protected class. And the impacts are leaking out into the commons, so everybody's now paying attention. And I think that that's something that people can start looking at what's gone on in Indigenous communities and what continues to go on in Indigenous communities around the world to really get a good idea of where we're going as a global population. And as everybody else has outlined, that the picture is not favorable to any of us. And I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge the courage that Carola exhibited in taking the action that she did. Not only is she all of these titles, she is a human being who has not forgotten her humanity. And I want to acknowledge that because that's really important to our pathway forward, is remembering our humanity in this process. I was on a climate change strategy session all day yesterday with folks from all over, and there were 2 people from Puerto Rico who were on that call who were bracing for the storms that are coming in and asked us all to keep them in our thoughts, as they're still reeling from the harm that has been caused previously by devastating storms. And so, we're in this real-time scenario where it's not just what have these impacts from the past taught us. We're learning right now, trial by fire and often by water, what it is that we need to be doing moving forward. And so, I think that when you talk about this siloed nationhood approaches that Carola talked about, all of that stuff is really goes to the core of what the problem is. The problem is that people are operating under this myth of separation, this idea of a siloed and protected life. And so one of the things that I think that Indigenous people can teach that's most important is this whole notion of interrelatedness and interdependence, whole systems thinking, where we recognize that we can't be protected within our silos because our silos are all intertwined if we are denying the safety of others. And so, thinking about the problems that we're facing right now in regard to whole systems rather than fragmented, saleable, compartmentalized, commodified pieces is going to provide us with a more healthy and more realistic pathway forward. If we continue the same thinking that has led us to the problem, then we're never going to be able to solve the problems that we have before us in the amount of time that we have to do so. And I think that one of the challenges is going to be dealing with what I believe is the most powerful addiction on the planet, which is really preventing us from addressing the things that need to be addressed. And also, it's where the bulk of the resources Larry was talking about are being implemented in protecting our addiction to consumption. And so, this way of life that's not sustainable is being protected at all costs. And instead of shifting to what we call Skidjunawevamosawagan, which is a way of life that's in harmony with the rest of creation. And when we think about what are some of the most common adaptation and mitigation strategies for climate change, oftentimes for Indigenous peoples, what's proposed is that they move away from their traditional way of life, the way of life that has allowed us to maintain the last protected places on the planet, into the market economy. I mean, that's insanity, right? It's insanity to try to solve the problems that we're facing, that people who are in places that have been defended and protected successfully for millennia because of a value system that's based on relationships and not commerce, and move them away from relationships and toward commerce, which is what's killing us all. And so we have to really have this radical change in our thinking. And I think that that's really important. And so you see a lot of people are really reaching out for traditional ecological, traditional Indigenous knowledge. And what's being understood in that reach is that we have millennia-long studies of the complex relationships that exist between all systems within creation, and that we have actively observed and participated in. And so when we think about what's contained in Indigenous knowledge, you know, ethnobotany, climatology, ecology, biology, archaeology, psychology, sociology, ethnomathematics, you know, deeper spiritual teachings. There's so much that's in that. I had the incredible honor of being included in this book that's coming out next month called All We Can Save, which is a compilation of essays from women, from frontline activists to NASA scientists who are working on climate change and climate justice. And there's another problem. The climate science folks very, very infrequently are sitting down with the climate justice folks. And so there's a disconnect in all of these different places that we need to be able to figure out how to bridge so that we can really start working together and move out of our siloed separationist thinking that's leading to our destruction. So when I think about what can Indigenous people offer, I think it's a shift in that way of thinking that is much more profound than we can be providing in a soundbite here today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sherri. I'd like to invite Larry and Carola and Pablo back on. Hopefully you guys can get your video and your audio working. I am going to feel bad for myself for a second and admit that there's so much ground here I think we could cover and not a lot of time to do it in. So forgive me for not being able to get to all these really, really interesting threads that you guys have brought up. I guess, first of all, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to one another without me getting in the way. But of some of the things that have been brought up here, I want to tease at something that Sherri, you just talked about, and that I feel like might be a bit in tension with something you had said, Pablo. And I think it's not a tension between the two of you, it's a tension that we all have to carry. And that is that in a previous conversation actually I had with you, Sherri, you talked about we can't tear down the master's house with the master's tools, right? And some of that is you know, these tools of domination, right, and exploitation. Pablo, you talked about the fact that we have a fight on our hands, and we're, you know, in the midst of what we might call an unraveling that is, I think, unavoidably going to get worse. And there are, you know, you talked about the capitalism of chaos. Larry, you talked about predatory capitalism. You know, Carola, you talked about, you know, green fortresses, you know, and so if ultimately for us to get through the challenge that we face is going to require us to really fundamentally change how we are in relationship with one another and with nature, but we still have a fight on our hands. How do we square that? How do we hold those two things at the same time? So curious to hear from any of you what your thoughts are about that.
I've had some very serious thoughts on that, particularly of late. I happen to belong to 3 groups in the United States that are working on the November 3rd elections. and we've run simulations on that, and the kind of chaos we're talking about might come to the United States a little quicker than a lot of people think. Not necessarily caused by the climate crisis, but certainly caused by the predatory capitalist system that we have let go rampant for the past half century, but particularly since about 1990. It's clear, and more military leaders are understanding this, that the neoliberal economic system and predatory capitalism let loose without any check is destroying us and destroying the globe too. What do we do about that? That's a huge discussion because these are people who are called upon by the state to go out and kill other people for the state. It's not a morale and good order and discipline building discussion within the military, I will assure you. But they realize, and others too, that this is unsustainable, that it has to change. And how do you get started changing it if, as was implied by other speakers, the very system you're trying to change, you are immersed in at the same time you're trying to change it? And by immersed, I mean it's your livelihood. It's your, quote, future, unquote. It's your security. It's everything you've been brought to expect about the fulfillment of your life. And yet it's now threatened to the extent that it's impossible. How do you change that? Politically, how do you go about changing that? That's, I think, a question for every citizen on this globe right now to ponder.
Go ahead, Sherri.
I think that, you know, we're dealing with a situation that is not, certainly not newly arrived, and it's deeply embedded, and it's going to take time to unravel it. However, there needs to be some really radical movement that has to occur in order to deal with our, you know, if we look at pandemic profiteers, I mean, there's a handful of people who have made $300 billion off the pandemic while people are suffering and dying. And then we have people at the very top who are instigating conflict between human beings over the wearing of a mask. It's insanity. It's insanity. And so we really have to get ourselves out of this us versus them conquest mentality. It's this conquest mindset constantly that we have to conquer this and we have to conquer that. And all we're doing is repeating cycles that have been going on for millennia. And so we need to be able to shift our thinking away from acts of conquest to really addressing the illusion and the virus of separation in our minds so that we can instead transcend our differences, cycle forward together, integrate what works, let go of what doesn't, and then move forward as a whole. And so this whole concept of oneness is not sameness. The concept of oneness is steeped in this idea of acceptance and valuing of diversity, because that's what whole systems teaches us, is that when we have more diversity, when we are incorporating more diversity into our system, rather than this us against them, I need to conquer this person, I need to go to war against this, whatever issue it is or whatever group it is. When we're fostering diversity, we're actually building social coherence, and we're creating a more stable and harmonious environment. And so if we're not willing to do something really radical to shift us in that direction, we're not going to survive. I mean, and that's just the reality of it. We're going to exit the planet as a group. And so we have to be willing to take really radical steps. And that can't be the status quo business as usual way of making change. It has to be something that's a real clear departure from the way that we've been living up to date and moving into a way of living that's more aligned with supporting and preserving and cultivating life, which is going to mean that we're going to have to step back. We're going to have to step ourselves back from the edge and really rethink our priorities and our value systems. And in my mind, the way that we do that is by bringing in more matriarchs into the discussion, more mothers and grandmothers whose job it has always been to think about the preservation and the protection of the life of those that they love, because that voice has been notably absent from the discussions that we've been involved in.
Pablo, Carola, either of you have a, go ahead, Pablo.
Yes, well, no, I'm in favor of trying to bring all diversity, but I think we have to recognize we're in the middle of a deep struggle, very deep. When we see, for example, big agribusiness in our country promoting forest fires in order to have more cattle for export, what do? Let's come all together, let's be all common souls. You have to organize, and you have to build a force that is strong enough to stop them. So it's a matter of balance of forces. And if we don't win this battle, they will burn the forest. And it's not a problem of arguments. We can explain them the issue of climate change and the importance of a forest, and that this is the house of indigenous people. But for them, the key thing is how much money they are going to make out of this business, out of exporting meat to China. So we have to build a front that is strong enough to stop them. And that front has to be from indigenous people, from environmental groups, from groups in the urban areas. And sometimes it gets violent. The amount of indigenous people, environmental activists that they have killed in Brazil, we're speaking about hundreds. So I really think we have to, if we see it in this way, the key thing is how we build an alliance that is able to stop this. Because I think we need to achieve concrete victories in order to create another future. And in relation to what Larry said, I agree with him. The problem is, and somebody also asked, we need the state to intervene, but we also need to change the state. There is a problem when we, and I was part of the government, go into the government. We in a form, when you go into the government, are transformed by the state. So if we only are thinking in taking the state in order to good things, that's not going to happen because the state has its own dynamic. So we really have to transform the state from inside, but also from outside, which I think is the missing piece that we have seen in the past, not only decades, but centuries.
Carola, any thoughts from you in reaction?
Yeah, I would think that it's incredibly important to name the problem and be clear about what the problem is. Many here have already said is capitalism is causing this huge inequality and the environmental breakdown. And of course, the rampant racism everywhere connected to that. But I think we shouldn't see the people within the system as a type of enemy. I think we really should try to avoid polarization where we can and try to make connections and win people over by providing a vision of a better future. And that idea how things could actually be differently and better, I think that is the way how we could win people over and make them join into creating that. And I think the positive, different possibility for the future is what is largely absent in terms of narrative when we speak about crisis in any way.
How do we square that, offering a more positive vision with being honest about the fact that the consequences of what humanity has been doing for the last however many centuries is unavoidable on some level? Any thoughts on that?
Asher, the scholar of history in me, picking up on others' remarks and my own thoughts, indicates very strongly that, and I'll go back to Pablo's comments, this is going to require a significant effort that might lead to violence. And I can't tell you any time in history when major change has occurred, and it has occurred in the way we're talking about it having to occur now without some bloodshed. I don't know how that forms in the concept of what we've talked about here. I don't know how it shapes itself. I don't know how it happens. But I think we're looking at a change, and people have said it here, and I agree with them, in the elite. And the elite are motivated by essentially one thing: money and more money and more money, power and more power and more power. And if the people are going to change that, the people writ large are going to change that, I'm afraid it's going to take something more than Dr. Martin Luther King's nonviolent protests. I'm afraid it's going to take blood in the street. I hope I'm wrong, but I can see that as a scholar of history and episodes throughout human history that have reflected this sort of tendency or predilection. I can see that happening. And frankly, if it were to change things positively, I'm not so sure I wouldn't participate.
You know, I think that there's this really profound quote, and I think a lot of these things become profound because, you know, they help us to understand the fallibility of our human nature. And the quote is, if you want to know where you're going, look at where you've been. And I agree with Larry. If we continue to follow the path that history has painted for us, we will end up in exactly the same place. And so if we want to end up somewhere different, then we're going to have to take a different path. And so there was this story that I heard, the nutshell version of it was, I walked down a street, there was a giant hole, and I fell in. The next day I walked down the same street and I saw the giant hole and I fell in anyway. It took me forever to get out. The third day I walked down the street, I saw the giant hole. I tried not to fall in, but I fell in anyway, but I got out a little bit quicker. The fourth day I walked down the street, I saw the giant hole, I walked around it, and on the fifth day I walked down a new street. We're on day 5. We have to walk down a new street. We have to do something different than we've done in the past unless we want to have blood running in the streets. We have to be willing to be courageous enough to take a chance on something that maybe has never been done. The only way that we're going to get there is to bring together a collective of diverse voices that's going to be able to help us to define and to outline something that is more in alignment with what most of our values truly are. Most of us, our values truly are for the preservation of one another's lives, for the preservation of the earth. We want to be able to continue living on this planet. We don't want people to suffer, just like we don't want to suffer ourselves, right? And so if we can start living in alignment with our values, one of the greatest quotes I ever heard, and I can't remember the woman who said it, she's in the climate movement as well, and she said, why are we collectively working so hard to build a world that none of us really wants to live in? And that's the question before us. Why are we doing that? And so in my book, Sacred Instructions, I talk about this 80-10-10 rule, that we have to be willing to acknowledge what's going on. We need 10% of our time to look around, see what's wrong, what needs to be corrected. We need to speak about it. We need to define it, right? We need to talk about what that is. And then we need to use another 10% of our energy in what I call obstructive activism. And that word for that in our language, in our warrior language, is samagnas. You use just enough force to stop the other from causing you harm without harming the other, because it's a stand in protection of the sacredness of life. And then you invest 80% of your time building the new. And so as you're building the new, you're taking away your support of the old, and it dies of natural causes. Right now it's being kept alive by artificial means. In the form of subsidies. And so, how we do that, the answers are out there. We just haven't been courageous enough to take the action as we the people, the large majority of human beings on the earth who really want to survive, we haven't been courageous enough or unified enough to be able to take that movement. And I think that now is the time for us to do that. Thank you.
Pablo, you talked about changing government, and you talked about the role of government. You talked about changing government from within and without, right? In your view, Sherri just created a kind of a framework for thinking about how people put their energy, where they put their energy. In your view, is it, when we think about us collectively, is it a matter of different people playing different roles, or is it a matter of people trying to operate in all of those spaces kind of simultaneously? So when you talk about inside and outside government, are those the same people, or are they different people? How do you envision that? Oh, sorry, we can't hear you.
I think that the traditional view that comes, for example, from groups of the left is that you have to take power in order to do changes. But I would say that to take state power has several risks that you only can counterbalance if you're able to build power from the grassroots. So the more you decentralize power, the more you develop commons at different levels, the more able we are going to be able to face this systemic crisis. The role of the state is key, and we need to democratize the state. We need to, for example, bring nature into democracy, because our democracy is a very anthropocentric democracy. Only humans vote. Humans decide for everybody. Where is nature? Nature doesn't have a say. Nature is not represented. So we really have to think in a different kind of democracy, where you have nature as such, also injustice in the judicial system. But the key thing is there are many things that can be done by communities, by collective groups, and we have to promote this. I think that you say, do we have a positive discourse in these times of chaos? Yes, I think it is possible and it's needed. For example, for us in Bolivia, what are we going to do if we keep deforesting only to export GMO soybean? We should promote more ecological production, diversify our production. This will increase the health of all the people. We would be able to resist more different kind of pandemics. So we have the possibility to have a very different kind of life. And this is key if you want to win this battle. Because for me, it is a battle. We need to throw Bolsonaro out of the government in Brazil, and we need to bring him to justice. There is no other way. This is, I mean, it's not revenge, it's justice.
Thanks. I want to turn to some of the questions we've gotten. A number of them are around positive narratives and visions. So if you were to be in conversation with people, if it's people you know personally or professionally, and you help them understand the systemic nature of what we face right now and what we are going to likely be facing, and they ask you, well, what? That sounds terrible. What do we do, and what is a vision of the future that people will want to have? So what would be your answer to that question? I'll put somebody on the spot. Carola, you talked about a positive vision earlier. What is the positive vision that you would offer people that's based on this reality that we're grappling with?
Well, I guess Sherri has already mentioned quite a few common values that people around the globe actually share, like an idea about justice, an idea about being inclusive. I think particularly because the trends for the biosphere and also for human beings look so devastating, I think it becomes even more necessary and also possible for people to understand that the way they have been dealing with any non-human beings and also with any just people from other places is not going to lead us anywhere as a global shared human species. And I think we really need a very, very profound and deep shift in our understanding where we are as human beings within the web of life, as has already been pointed out. We need an end to this dualist perspective, which actually only exists in this Western industrial society with man having dominion over nature. That completely needs to change. And we need to end the separation between different human beings. And that is the general change in narrative, which we really need. And we need to focus, I think, on the well-being of all the forms of life on this planet, instead of just providing for the well-being of a few. That is obviously the general narrative. And I think it seems that most of the people who are in this panel have already kind of spoken to that in a certain sense.
Anything to add, Pablo, Larry, or Sherri, on this question of positive vision or positive narrative?
I'll go back to the suggestions and recommendations that these groups that I've been working with on the election in November in the United States, and say that one of the most formidable arguments that was put forward yesterday, as a matter of fact, by those who have been the most pessimistic and the most cynical, was that a minimum of 200 million Americans, should this election be stolen, needed to take to the streets. Not with guns, not with an idea to violence, but just to show that they're angry, their democracy has been stolen. I think that's an important part of this. I don't know how you get 7.8 billion people, or at least a workable minority, if nothing else, of those to do that sort of thing. But I think Pablo's right, whether it's in Brazil or it's in the United States or it's in Germany or wherever, the people have to get aroused and they have to demand action on issues like those about which we're talking this morning. It just doesn't work unless you have that kind of mass. And I go back to a Chinese poet, artist, activist, Liu Sun, who worked for Sun Yat-sen, and when Sun Yat-sen's efforts were stopped, worked for Mao Zedong, became disenchanted with the communists, and just went to write his poetry. And he said once, if I translate the Chinese right, something like this: you can talk about almost anything. You can debate and you can get away with it. But when you talk about the maldistribution of wealth in the world, get your guns. Well, what Sherri said is absolutely right, except for one thing. There is a small elite in this world, particularly in the global north, but I would say also in Brazil and elsewhere, that does like this lifestyle, and they want it to continue. They're the Charles Kochs, they're the Robert Mercers, they're the Sheldon Adelsons in my country. They want it to continue, and they're willing to kill you to make it continue. So that's what we're up against.
I don't dispute that at all. And I don't believe that I ever said that there wasn't a small population of people who was interested in harming the rest of us, because that's why we're here, right?
And I wasn't insinuating that you were saying that.
Yeah, I think that it's important to recognize that, but I also think that It's a very, very small percentage of the population who truly desires to harm others. And that there are a lot more people who don't have that desire. And you're right, we need to mobilize that group. And so
I think in my own country, that group is about 0.001 of the population, but they're very powerful.
As to, I do have a question I'd like to pose to Larry after, but I would like to say, for painting a good picture, one of the things that I've been seeing and that I'm involved with myself, and have been building a network of people all the way from Maine to Alabama here on the East Coast, is people moving into community with one another, people building community, moving towards food sovereignty, water sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and taking away their support and participation in the larger systems that are causing so many problems. And it's not just a one-path solution to address the mass scale problems that we have. There are multiple avenues that need to be engaged in order to make that kind of change happen. But one of the really positive things that I'm seeing, in addition to some divestment from some of these bigger financiers of environmental destruction, is just people disengaging, and also the younger populations are not enamored of this life of excess. They are more enamored with going back toward a simpler way of living. They seem to be holding aloft a value system that has been lost to many of the last few generations, that is aligned with the belief that all living beings, whether they are human beings or not, have an intrinsic value that needs to be honored and recognized. And so I'm encouraged by both of those things rising up simultaneously. This youth movement where we have younger people who are very, very aware, well-versed, and knowledgeable. They're not just repeating what they've heard others say. They have deep understanding of where we are and what's required for us to move out of it. And they're rising up in that. And then we also have a lot of people exiting the system and moving into more balanced and stable forms of community. And so, there is, that's to me an indication of shift happening. And so I think that those two things give me hope.
In the little time we have left, I do want to get to some of the questions we've gotten from folks, and we've gotten a lot of great questions. But Sherri, you mentioned you had a question for Larry. You wanted to. Yeah,
I just, Larry, I used to do this show called Love and Revolution Radio with a friend of mine named Gravera Sun, and we had some folks who came on to talk about the fact that the U.S. military is perhaps the #1 polluter on the planet. And if it's not first, it's a very, very close second. And that the force, the might of the U.S. military has often been used to protect fossil fuel infrastructure, capitalistic interests. And so how do you square what you're talking about in regard to neoliberalism with the fact that the U.S. military has been a large contributor to some of the problems that we're facing right now? I just would be interested in your take on that, because it's a glaring hypocrisy that I think many people are curious about.
Well, there's no question about what you said. If we were ranked, the military, Department of Defense, were ranked with countries, it would be 55th, right next to Portugal, in terms of fossil fuel consumption. It is probably the largest polluter on the face of the earth when you take into consideration jet fuel, tank fuel, and everything else. What I was trying to imply was not that it is a state instrument. When the president says to a young man or a young woman, go die for state purposes and kill other people for state purposes, that's what activates the military to do the kinds of things that we're talking about, to include pollution. What I was trying to imply is that there are minds in the military. There are smart people in the military. I would argue the military is the only bureaucratic entity in America that thinks strategically, that are very concerned about the future, and even questioning where that state that orders them to go to Afghanistan and Iraq for no reason other than to protect the interests of that 0.001. And they're asking themselves, why are they doing that? And they're asking themselves, why is this instrument of which I am a professional member doing this for the state? That's a serious debate. It's a very serious debate. It's one that could affect the future of this country majorly, one way or the other, positive or negative. That's all I'm trying to suggest, that there are bright people thinking about these problems in other places than people might suspect.
I just want to pick up on that, Larry. You mentioned earlier that, is it fair to say that the military sees its role increasingly as one of aid, because we're seeing, more crises that the military is being asked to step in to provide support?
Yes, we're even having an internal debate. It's small right now, but we're trying to encourage it, those of us who believe this way, that we need conscription, and we're going to need something like the old Civilian Conservation Corps that Franklin Roosevelt had during the Great Depression, of 5 to 6 million men and women who would not be trained to be killers, not be trained to be soldiers in the traditional sense, but be trained to be climatologists, if you will, or climate crisis troops, who would do the kinds of things both domestically and internationally that the military likes to do, like it did in Operation Sea Angel in Bangladesh, or like it did in Indonesia in 2005. Many soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines told me that was the most satisfying thing they ever participated in, was helping Indonesia get back on its feet, especially Aceh province. So they're looking at the possibility in the future of having to mobilize millions of men and women in order to meet the challenges we're just briefly talking about here.
Thanks. Yeah, Pablo.
Yes, I just wanted to bring, we're discussing that in order to create a new path, we have to transform the state. But this means we also have to transform the army. This is a key element of the state. In the case of Bolivia, I think we failed, because when we wrote our constitution in 2009, we wanted to decolonize the army because it has a vertical structure. And we have to democratize the army forces. There has to be a structural change. And if this doesn't happen, I think we're not going to solve key issues. Also, another aspect is we have to look at the new kind of multilateralism. No, I think that what we see now is the UN is in a deep crisis. It really has not acted in the middle of the health crisis, and the Security Council is an obsolete organization. It's from World War II. So if we want to address this systemic crisis that is global, we need to rethink the UN or reinvent the UN, as some say it. And this means, for example, that we have to have institutions, global institutions, that have power when it comes to environmental agreements. Because what is it that we have when it comes to the environment? The Paris Agreement with no teeth. You can do whatever you want. There is no sanction, no penalty. But so, and the Security Council has acted in the majority of the cases in order to preserve the interests of some countries, and not the countries itself, but of those tiny portions of the population that we have spoken about. So I think there is a problem in the future on rethinking and transforming, reinventing these institutions at national and at global level.
Thanks. I want to get to a question just around kind of the individual transformation. So Sherri, you mentioned you'd acknowledged Carola's humanity, right, in stepping forward and taking the risk that she did. I'm curious to hear from you, Carola, your view. I think a lot of people hear your story and stories of others and, find it understandably remarkable and maybe also unique. Do you feel that it is unique? Is it something innate? Is it something unusual, or is it something you feel like is common for people? And how did you tap it? And I'm curious to hear from others. How do you think about fostering people's humanity in at the same time dealing with the battles that we're dealing with? So let's start with you, Carola.
I don't think there was anything particularly remarkable in a decision to protect other people in a moment that you can. I think a lot of people make a similar decision every day on various types of issues. If they get into that situation, and I do believe a lot into people actually acting out of the situation and not just because of their character. So I don't think that we are all that massively different and that only a certain type of people would do certain things. I just think if you get to that situation where you find yourself in, you already probably have taken a few things and have happened to you, and you have taken a few decisions which led you to even being in that place and to start with. And if you are in that situation, the decision becomes quite natural. There have been, just on a side note, many other captains actually in the Mediterranean, also within the last years, who have done extremely similar things. However, it was just by chance that I got all the media attention on that specific point of time, but other captains have done the absolutely very same thing. And I think we see that also just in the large amount of people, for example, who are criminalized for so-called crimes of solidarity with refugees and migrants within the European Union. There's a large amount of them, several hundreds, and they all have done things to aid someone else. So there's absolutely nothing special. And I think it goes to an important point, which is that some people kind of seem to think that only a certain individuals have the power or the capacity or the skills or talent or whatever to make changes. But I don't think that's the case. I think everyone can, because all these people who we now think they are famous for doing whatever they have done, they have started somewhere as in unknown small people. And there's absolutely no point of waiting for anyone else, because you have to do it. No one else will solve the problems for you. And I think that goes back to the core question of how can we mobilize a lot of people to do something? Because all these 80 people here will not do very much, but how do we mobilize and how do we give people that feeling of agency that they can actually make some little contribution and change? They actually can change something and that it's worth doing it. I think that's a really, really core question. How do we motivate people to start doing something?
Do you have an answer to your own question? Or is it something?
I think it can be helpful to have positive examples. It can be helpful to show that in the past, sometimes change has happened quite quickly in moments where it was not expected, or where a person who has done the same thing, which has been done before 100 times, suddenly has a huge effect. So it's always worth doing something, because sometimes the outcome is much bigger than you think it could be. And the core, I think, is not trying to do everything yourself, but really to draw other people in.
Thanks, that's a great answer. So I'm going to give you guys a choice here. I want to give everyone an opportunity to either share some thoughts, some closing thoughts based upon the conversation we've had, or things that you feel we didn't have a chance to touch upon. Or building off of what Carola just talked about and questions we've received from people, can you share a positive, plausible, compelling story of how we might live in this kind of unraveling? When you have a vision of how to be in this moment and in the coming years and decades ahead. So your choice. And let's see, I'm going to put Sherri on the spot first. Is that fair? Maybe it's not fair, but I'm going to do it anyway.
But you're going to do it anyway. You know, if these are our closing thoughts, I would just like to thank everybody that has been a part of this. I really value the diversity of voices that have been brought together here, and I think that we can all learn from one another. And I have been, you know, challenged and also uplifted by everything that's been offered by the other panelists here today, and by Laurie's presentation, and you know, all of the discussion has been important and meaningful, and I think we need to be doing a lot more of this. So I guess one of the things that I think is critically important right now, we need to, we can't do this in a soundbite, and I think this is part of the problem, is that our discussions are often reduced to sound bites, and you can't say, how do we solve you know, 3,000 years of capitalism? And so the first product put into the exchange economy was the body of women in exchange for land. And so, you know, and that was in 3000 BCE, right? And so now we're talking 5,000 years of capitalism. And so how do we shift our thinking? And how do we tell people how to do that in 5 minutes? We don't. You know, we don't tell people how to do that in 5 minutes. But what we can encourage people to do is to look at that 5,000 years of entrainment and conditioning, and ingrained thinking and learned obedience to systems and structures that have led us to this place, and to stop and ask ourselves in a moment of choice, whose voice is in my head right now? And where is that voice coming from? And what has informed that voice? And who is that voice beholden to? And is that voice aligned with the values that I hold? Because I think we act automatically, oftentimes in alignment with that conditioning and that training. When you have had 1,000-year periods, 1,200-year periods, where you have, you know, the most powerful institution on the planet during that certain 1,200-year period that I'm talking about, the Roman Catholic Church, burning and drowning and killing people in horrific ways for falling out of alignment with their dictates. And then you have governments that have rolled out of that, and other belief systems, educational systems, entire social structures that are in alignment with that kind of entrainment and obedience building system and structure. You start wondering why people are having such a difficult time with critical thinking in this time, because they haven't been taught how to think critically. And so we need to be questioning that inner voice. We need to be questioning that entrainment. We need to be questioning all of the conditioning of the last several thousand years, and we need to understand how that's brought us to this point in time. And then once we start really examining that, I think that we open up a space that makes way for creative intelligence to rise up, our own inner voice to rise up and to guide us back on the path that we need to be walking on in order for us to survive. So,
thanks so much, Sherri. Larry, I'm going to turn to you now. So either some thoughts that you want to share that are in response, or your vision that you might offer for how we can navigate this potential unraveling.
Maybe a little of both. I'm given my moments of optimism and hope by a group called, in particular, by a group called the Citizens Climate Lobby in the United States, who are constantly sending me emails or telephoning or whatever and telling me about a 1,700-acre solar complex that's just been completed in Texas, that is built on, and the individual who is doing it admits this, land that used to have derricks on it. And he did it because he wanted to be able to pay the taxes on the other 10,000 acres he owns and runs cattle on. That's the system working, if you will, to do what it should do. Or I get a call from San Diego and they tell me about the wonderful alliance that's been set up out there between the United States Navy, nonprofits, the city of San Diego, and the federal government to deal with the problems they have on their coastline with sea rise. Or whether it's some other element of the lobby. Austin, Texas, for example, an individual telling me that they've had the most day-on-day 100+ degree days in the history of that city, and what that's energized people to do because they are finally convinced that this climate crisis is not a hoax. Or whether it's someone coming in from another state or another situation and telling me about this little movement that is taking place now that is finally ameliorative or going to be ameliorative. Or whether it's the big movement to get the legislation now in the United States Congress passed, and it's looking more and more favorable, that will put a massive tax on carbon use. These kinds of things that are coming in from all across the country. And I have to say also from Germany, Japan, other places, give me hope and give me optimism that eventually this juggernaut of people's efforts is going to ameliorate this situation. I can get pretty pessimistic about it too, because it's just small steps, but in aggregate, maybe it'll be enough.
Thanks. Carola, thoughts or a response to the question about your vision?
Well, I would just actually like to thank everyone involved for creating and hosting this opportunity for us to have these conversations now and in the next days. I think it's incredibly important, and it might be a first step towards creating some type of community which starts deeper thinking from various angles about what might be happening and which different trajectories there could be. I have found myself that it's incredibly important in challenging work that is being carried out, that there is a type of community, be it either in these sea rescue organizations where we have a very strong volunteer community spirit to actually make all that work happen. But also we see that the people who are affected from this lack of access to asylum, who are, for example, in the offshore detention on Manus in Papua New Guinea, who have been there for 6 years, some of them are now transferred to Australia, they have incredibly benefited from people in other places standing by their side and supporting them from the outside. These types of communities across borders are incredibly important. And I hope that we can just deepen this conversation and extend it towards other people.
Thank you. Pablo?
Yes, well, thank you very much. It has been a pleasure to discuss with all of you, and thank you, Asha, for the invitation. I think in order to promote a change, and even a systemic change, we need to address dreams. We need to address a new narrative. But we also need to address needs, because the majority of the people are living the daily day trying to solve their material needs. And in our proposals, we have to take this in account. When we are able to create a narrative that addresses dreams and concrete needs that are very material for the vast majority of the population, then we can move forward and address and create a new balance of forces and address change. For in my life, the most biggest experience that I have had was in the year 2000, when in Bolivia, in Cochabamba, we had to fight against the privatization of water, and how to bring people from rural areas, urban areas, different sectors together in order to fight against this privatization of water and succeed when we were defeated in all the privatization, in all other privatization process, was key. And on one hand, of course, there was to address the concrete need of people that don't want to pay a higher bill for drinking water, but there is also the image that, hey, water is the blood of Mother Earth, and you cannot privatize the blood of Mother Earth. And what is going to happen if this continues? And what this means for human rights, and what this means for the rights of Pachamama, the rights of nature. So then you are able to bring many different kind of groups with different kind of interests and perspectives together in a way that they are a critical mass that is able to stop this and change it. And I still, even now, think that if we want to address change, we have to start from somewhere, for some concrete aspect. Like Carola. Carola is addressing a very concrete and very critical thing, the issue of migrants. And for me here in Bolivia, our challenge is now to try to galvanize and concentrate forces around the issue of the deforestation in the Amazon, the destruction of this. And if we have concrete strategies for concrete elements that are able to grow and grow, I think change is possible. I really believe in humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for that story, Pablo. And I have a story that is exactly that thing, where we were working with a group of water protectors who were indigenous to North America, who were trying to protect their water from hydrofracking. And there was this really contentious struggle that was going on where the drivers of the thumper trucks were actually driving into people. There were people, hired militia in the trees with guns with rubber bullets, and it was a pretty ugly situation. And we went in, my organization went in, and we worked with people who were on the front line and talked to them about finding interest convergence points with those that they were sitting there in this radical opposition to. And they completely changed their tactic and started speaking to the humanity, speaking to the heart, speaking to the things that the people who were on the other side held most dear. So they started telling them, we care about your children, that's why we're standing here. We don't want your children to die of aggressive forms of cancer any more than we want ours to die of aggressive forms of cancer. What came out of that was one day, one of the drivers of the thumper truck stopped outside of where the indigenous people were standing at a holding area where they were getting food and getting warm, because this was happening in the middle of the wintertime in a northern tier area. And people were all nervous, but then the grandmothers came forward, remembering their training, and said, come in and get warm by our fire, have something to eat. And the man fell to his knees and started to cry and said, I don't want to hurt your children. This is the only way I know how to make a living. If you show me how to do something else, if you give me the opportunity to do something else, I'll do it. And so that just shows that we need to be finding those interest convergence points and building those new opportunities for people to step into, because more often than not, there are good people on the other side as well who are just looking for the moment when they can shift. So I just want to thank you, Pablo, for what you said. That was really beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherri. That was a great note to end on. I really appreciate all of you, not only your time in joining us, but for all the work that you do and effort that you make. to help humanity and the other species that we share this planet with. So I'm going to turn it over back to Ruth and Peter, and they will share some of their closing thoughts. And take it away, guys.
Peter, go for it.
Well, at the same time as listening to that wonderful and thought-provoking conversation, I was reading the Q&A with some absolutely brilliant contributions. So this is just going to be a kind of smattering. It really struck me how fascinating it was to have Larry talking about what was going on inside the military for a whole range of reasons. Firstly, it reminded me of how easy it is to fall into associating people with their institutions. And, you know, hearing Larry describe that growing military questioning about the role of predatory capitalism, when in some ways the role of the military has been to be the enforcer for predatory capitalism, was just a brilliant reminder of human potential. And of course, that's what we need. So much of the discussion revolves around how we elicit values around compassion or connection or empathy, whether it's within humanity or at a broader level across the whole family of different species. And that, you know, it was fascinating that was such a strong theme. You know, we all have those values in us. How do we bring them out? And some of the stories that you told, like the story you just told there at the end, Sherri, was exactly that, wasn't it? It was about eliciting compassion and love, basically. So you know, is this polycrisis that we're facing, this kind of connecting different crises emerging, is it going to enable us to transform inside ourselves enough to respond in a proportionate way? And then, you know, people like Carola, you were talking about the importance of having a community around us, and we're social beings, aren't we? We need that community. So these kinds of discussions and the positive stories and the examples, can we somehow find ways to spread them and to not just invite the people who we feel already agree with us, but to invite others in and to enable that diversity and to find that shared core of purpose. And I thought, you know, not just the panelists, but the questions in the Q&A really pointed at the depth of that and the need for that, and for us to be brave and take risks. The time is short, and it would be very easy to focus entirely on responding to the immediate pressing urgent needs, which are very real, very pressing, right in our faces. People are dying. But to as we do that, somehow enable ourselves to connect with those different values and to think about how we give other people the space and the safety to kind of bring those values out. So I've taken up too much time. Over to you, Ruth.
I think for me, what stayed quite strong is this idea that how do we change the system? The system is self-preserving, and how do we change the system that we're fully immersed in, you know, that we're, you know, fully embedded in the system, and that it's also very hard to give up on our own privilege when we're doing this work. And this, like, using the system to change itself versus creating the alternatives, like the alternatives to livelihoods, the alternatives to security. And I think for me, what made me think is that we need all of the strategies. So, for example, within the current system, there is the role of justice that I think we didn't mention so much. I think Pablo mentioned it a little bit, which is rights of nature, trialing Bolsonaro for ecocide, really using the work that Client Earth is doing of actually using justice and laws to using something that was deeply designed by the system to change the system itself. So I think that's a valid strategy. Equally, you know, building alternatives and the new narratives and constructing things the way we would like them to be with a high level of integrity is also important. And I wonder how much a group like this can be more strategic about how those two things come together, and be a little bit more strategic about paths that can seem that they are completely different, how do we make them work together and strengthen each other, so the people within the system are also equipped, and the people outside the system that, as Sherri said, chose the system. I love this. Resource those people so they can also bring change. Yeah. And then the last thing I wanted to say is, I think I have a solution, which is to just hand it over to young people and the grandmothers, and job done. I think, yeah. There.
So we're at our time. I just also wanted to finish by saying is that we don't see this as a one-off event. We see this as the beginning of an ongoing dialogue. And we definitely are going to be back in touch by email as soon as we can, once we've worked out next steps. And that we really, maybe the way to finish is to kind of agree with what people were saying about the need to spread these discussions, but more importantly, the actions that are aligned to these discussions. How do we exercise solidarity and strengthen it? How do we galvanize movements and collaborations that so many of us are involved in? So let's hope that this discussion can be spread and can be part of that process. So I'd really like to thank everyone, the people who've given up time to listen, and the fantastic questions that were posted, our wonderful panelists, Laurie for his presentation, and just the whole team of people that have come together to put this together. Thank you all.